Okay, so I'm just going to refilm a few of these because watching back I realised that my camera angle wasn't great, so things were falling off the table. So just to give you a quick overview of the paints that I use. So the first lot of paint that I used was this one here, which is Winsor Newton Pan. And this is fantastic because it has a different range of colours. There's a bit of everything. Obviously it's quite dirty because I've had it for a long time. So it's a fantastic place to start off. I also use, so this is solid paint. So it usually comes in pans and in different sizes, and there are a really big range of different colours as well. So it's not just available in a set. So you can get them all individually. I use it a lot for my metallic paint as well. So in addition to that, there is also liquid paint. So mainly when I'm painting, I use liquid paint and I put it into one of my palettes and work from there. So just to give you a bit of an overview, this is from a set of 12 that I got years and years ago in Japan. This is a real entry-level set, so it's quite cheap and it does have a range of different colours. So your basics, you know, 2 greens, 2 yellows, 2 reds, brown, black, etc, etc. So something like this is also a really fantastic place to start. So starting out, I'd either use a pan like this or a small set of liquid watercolour paints. So additionally, I also use a range of different brands and like paint series. So if you've been to an art store, you'll see there is quite a big selection, and often they do have swatches there and they tell you the different colours, and each one often has a different price depending on the pigment. So a lot of what I use are Winsor Newton, and you'll notice here that there are 2 different types. So the Cotman is sort of known to be lower quality than the professional, but honestly I haven't noticed any difference. Some of my favourite paints are Cotman rather than the professional, and honestly I actually just go for the colour rather than what whether it's professional or colour fast paint, which might come back to bite me one day, but I do tend to go for the colour of the paint rather than the quality. So some of the lower quality paints that I have, I use a lot because I really like their colour. So in addition to Winsor Newton, I also use some of the whole beam artist paints, and then one of my favourites is the Art Spectrum paints. So these are from an Australian company, so you get a wider range of colours that are actually really suited to Australian flora. And so this one here, which is the leaf green dark, I really like using for eucalypt, and it's hard to actually find colours like this in some of the international paint companies. I also use a German brand called Stockmar. These are fantastic for large panes of colour, and it's really good to use these ones for a wet and wet technique. In addition to paint, I also use ink. So this is a calligraphy ink that I have in gold, which is fantastic. I use it a lot for gold highlights, and you'll find again when using a wet and wet technique that ink is fantastic to get that beautiful flow across the paper. One of the last things I use is gouache. So this I use instead of a white watercolour paint. It's just personal preference, but I find it gives you a better final product, and the gouache is a stronger white. So if you're using it for highlights, I found it a lot easier to use in a white watercolour, which can become quite insipid. So that's just a few of the paints I use and how I use them. So generally when I'm buying paint, it's all the colour. Obviously there are different costs associated with different paints, but as you start off, so if you start off using a pan or just a simple pack of paints, you'll see what colours you're using more of, and then you can sort of go into those areas more and say, look, this is something I might be missing. I can invest in this paint over this one. Okay, so the last thing is paper. Now, if you're going to invest in anything when using watercolour, it's paper. So I'm sure most people have tried to use watercolour on just office paper and found that the paper will buckle and that you really don't get a very good response. You don't get that beautiful spread, and it can be a little bit of disaster and quite disheartening. So in saying that, you can still get away with a lower quality paper. So for example, this one here that I've been using for my sketching, I think I just got from Officeworks. So it's not that expensive. The one thing you do want to look out for is the GSM. So this is how thick the watercolor paper is. Personally, as a rule, I don't buy anything under 300 GSM. Maybe I'd get something about 250, but it'd be very rare because I find there is quite a difference between the 300 and thinner papers, because you do get that defined buckling of the paper, and it makes it hard when you've finished your painting to get it flat again. So I also personally go for a smoother surface. So this paper is probably the roughest paper I would use. It does have a bit of a texture to it, which can have a really nice feel, but just sort of have a look at what's going to suit you. Some works really work with a nice textured paper. I find smoother papers are easier to work on, and the paint I find flows better on it. Okay, so there are two main techniques when applying watercolor paint. So firstly, I'll just give you another insight. So when I'm painting, I use 2 jars of water. So one, for example, I would use for lighter colors and one for darker colors. Also, just one there spare, so if this one gets too dirty, you can go start using a new one without having to get up. Also, I've found, as with using jar lids as your palette, if you're using a jar lid for something like that, use the jar to put your water in. It can be a really easy way to do. And also I find, as I'm quite often putting paintbrushes in my tea, if your paint water doesn't look like a mug, it can be great because then you don't accidentally drink it. Ooh, still need that one. So just starting off, I've mixed here 2 different colors of paint together and mixed it in with water. So when you apply it to the paper, you get a very, very even coverage. That's because of the amount of water that you've mixed in. So if you're going for a flat, even coverage, that's the way to do it. Mix your paint in with water until you get an even flow there. Now, the other way to do it is to use the paint. I usually do this if the paint is still wet. And then if you use it straight from the tube, which isn't exactly great practice, but you'll notice that there's a big difference here in how even it is. So you can see there's darker spots and occasionally you get streaks through there. When using from the tube, I tend to avoid it. I try to put everything in a palette first, because if you're mixing colors, you can make the paint dirty. So you'll notice here that some of these paints are quite dirty. That's because they've had other colors mixed in, and there's not much else you can do about it once your paint gets dirty. So even though you're applying quite an even coverage, you can also add to it. So if you're putting the even coat down, you can add more color or more pigment to certain areas. This also applies the other way around. So if you want a certain place to be lighter, apply more water. And you can see there, the water pushes the paint away. Now, another technique to use as well is that you can add in more color. So if I was to add another color while the paint is still wet, you can get that beautiful gradient in between the 2 colors. By doing this when the paint is still wet, it really melds together quite nicely. I'll show you in a moment what you can do when the paint's dry. So the other thing to be aware of is if you are using 2 different colors next to each other, so say you're painting something and that area is red and this area is green, you want to make sure that the original paint is completely dry before you apply another color next to it. So I'll just apply this green here and you'll see what happens when the new wet paint hits the drying paint. So you can see the mix of colors. So that might be what you're after if you want a really thin line between these 2, but you can see how far the paint has gone in either direction, and it can really mess up your painting if that's not what you had in mind. You can get some beautiful effects, and you can blend it through the paint quite nicely. One of the things I find I do a lot is adding to where I've already painted, and if you have had that bit dry, if you rub your paintbrush over the top for a little bit, it should take the edge line away, and you can continue on without any really obvious mark there. So just to give you a bit of an overview as well is what happens when you put white on top. So if you're starting out painting, one thing I would do first is have a look at the paints you've got. So get them all out, and something I've found really useful is to make a swatch. So this is the majority of my paints, and what I've done here is obviously color coded them, and the first line is the paint color and the second line is mixed in with a white. So I've got a bit of a range, and I can see what colors I'll get by using certain paints. I also do that for different paintings. So if I'm working with certain colors for certain paintings, I mix them in together and make swatches as well. So this one here, I've mixed the colors together, and it works in a grid, so you can see what the colors look like when they've been mixed together. This is quite messy though. So once you know what colors you've got, a good way to start is to practice your different techniques. So this is we're still on the wet on dry technique, and I'll just show you quickly if you add white on top of this or different layers. So if we were to add white, you can see how strongly it comes through. Now again, by adding more water to your paint, it's always going to make the color lighter. And additionally, if you're not using much water, it makes the color quite dark. So again, we can go over this with the same color that we were using before and make it darker in certain areas. So a good way is just to practice the way the paint flows on the paper, adding more water, less water, and just seeing how it works for what you want it to. So the next technique is wet on wet. So I use a larger brush for this, and I'm just going to wet the paper. You can also soak the paper, and soaking the paper is a good technique to use as well if you want to stop it from buckling. It's not something I use, but you can definitely find good resources online that'll teach you how to strap your paper down so that it doesn't buckle as much. So again, I'm just using the watered down paint in my palette and applying it over where I've put the water. So you can see it makes that beautiful sort of feathered look to it. And again, you can just add more paint to the edges to get a stronger color. Using wet on wet is also fantastic for ink. You can get a beautiful flow of color across the water with ink. So you'll notice here as well that I have reached the edge of where I put the water to start with. So again, if I go in and create another line there, I'm using a wet on dry technique now. So you'll notice that there's no feathering. It's just quite a strong line. So that sort of gives you a bit of a starting point for using watercolors. I would just experiment around with it, overlay your colors, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. One thing to be aware of is not only when you're mixing colors, but I do this quite often, make sure you don't put your hand in the wet paint. So sometimes it's good if you've got a hairdryer on hand, you can dry the paint you've been working on and move to another area. Otherwise, just be aware of what parts of the painting are wet and make sure that you don't inadvertently smudge your paint. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a quick insight into some of the materials I use and some things that might help you out when you're just starting out with watercolour. If you do have any questions, please just send me a message, and I hope you found this useful.